On 25th of May, 1984, Stephen Patrick Morrissey and Giorgos Kyriakos Panayiotou were two of the three guests on BBC's mid-80s musical discussion show 8 Days a Week. Whilst Morrissey was, somewhat true to form, dismissive of Joy Division, the topic of discussion, host Robin Denslow was surprised that George Michael was a big fan of their second album, Closer. Both Morrissey and Michael were in two of the most popular British bands of the 1980s, and both bands lasted just 5 years before splitting up, never to reunite. Yet there was a gulf in the discourse surrounding both artists. Morrissey was in one of the most critically lauded bands of the 1980s, who blazed the trail for indie groups in the 90s and beyond, and the other was a great singer who would sell millions of records and achieve success as a solo artist, but ultimately started off in a teen pop band. Thanks to the recent Wham documentary on Netflix, it appears that there's a greater appetite to dig into their story in 2023 than existed in previous years. But even as Andrew Ridgeley states in the documentary, the band was only ever supposed to hit their targets before bowing out. Some could argue that this is nothing more than a cynical ploy to achieve fame and wealth. But in truth, not only was the group harboring one of Britain's best singer-songwriters, but the music they did give us between 1981 and 1986 reflects multiple influences from funk to synth-pop and even the nascent hip-hop scene. In this video, we take a look at 7 of the fantastic songs that saw the two adolescents from Bushy make it big in the 80s. Reach Up High and Touch Your Soul. Tonight's Slammin' 7 from the boys in Wham will help you reach that goal.
The Slammin' 7.
My name is Dan Whittle, and before we get started, please consider heading on over to our new website, cacophonysessions.com, and checking out all the latest goings on here at the Cacophony Sessions. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit that bell to stay notified. I've been a George Michael fan since I was around 9 years old, back in 1996. That year I sellotapped a black goatee beard to my face and sang Fast Love in the school talent show, despite being a year younger than all the other students participating. I was heavily into older around that time. I've got the 5 symbols from the Faith album cover tattooed on my arm. I got that a week before he died in 2016. And I was fortunate enough to be able to scream fanatically in his presence when he played Home Park Stadium in Plymouth in 2007. However, I've never really held the 2 Wham albums in such high regard, revisiting them in recent weeks, as well as the final, the music from The Edge of Heaven, and the newly released Echoes from the Edge of Heaven box set that includes all the extended remixes and versions that have been released as singles over the years. I've come up with a list of 7 songs that don't just hint at the behemoth that George Michael would become, but reveal a deep understanding of pop convention, and over time, a mastercraft in songwriting and self-reflection on an artistic level, all whilst cultivating a particular fan base that led to them selling over 30 million records in half a decade and provided a launch pad for George Michael's incredible solo career. Starting at the beginning, this single was first put out by Innovision in 1982 and failed to chart. It was not until January of the following year, after the band's surprise Top of the Pops performance of second single Young Guns, that this began to get any attention. The second release reached number 8 on the UK singles chart. This isn't exactly a hidden gem, but I do not feel that it gets enough respect as a single. There are several versions, including the social and unsocial mixes, the latter of which contains spicier lyrics, but the definitive version remains the version that you can find on the 1983 album Fantastic. Hip-hop was still in its infancy. King Tim III by the Fatback Band, Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang being the first records of the genre were recorded a mere 3 years earlier. This was 7 years before Vanilla Ice. Yet does George Michael suck as a rapper? No, sure, he's not exactly Rakim, but his lyrics speak to a disillusioned youth, and there's an incredible amount of soul lurking in that cadence. On the instrumental side of the record, a special shout-out should be reserved for Dion Estes, who was all over the Fantastic album and early George Michael solo records, with monstrous bass playing, straight out of a Confunction or Chic record. The recent documentary on Netflix, although excellent, it didn't give him enough credit as a cornerstone the band's musical direction, so may he rest in peace. The next song, chronologically in tonight's list, is also from the Fantastic LP, but does not contain any of Estes' playing. and is in fact performed solely by George Michael himself on a synthesizer, describing his anxiety following an early gay encounter. This is perhaps the first sign that George would go on to become generational talent, conveying a personal dilemma using easily identifiable lyrics, sultry vocal textures. This would go on to become George Michael's signature dish. And whilst the vocal work never reaches anywhere near the level that he would go on to display in the late 80s and the 90s and beyond, this in itself is like a mini origin story. In that documentary, it appears that George Michael found self-validation in the songwriting accolades that he was given. Elton John's presentation of an Ivor Novello Award clearly meant a great deal to him. Identifying the stepping stones throughout that process is fascinating. The production hasn't aged well, but it does represent the kind of experimentation that would lead us into the likes of Father Figure and Spinning the Wheel in the decades to come. Following the success of the first album in 1983, the band moved to Epic Records and made a second record in 1984 that George Michael produced himself, moving away from the high-octane band sound of the debut record with a stronger focus on more pop and soul singles. This contains a massive songs from the band, the classic Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, Everything She Wants, and George Michael's first solo release, of course, Careless Whisper. 4 of the 8 tracks were designated as singles, and it's one of the 8 that wasn't that I want to highlight here for a moment. Heartbeat is the very definition of a hidden gem. It follows the similarly Motown-inspired Wake Me Up Before You Go Go in the track listing, and it's just not as memorable as that song. But then that applies to everything from Branston Pickle to the whole Stuart dynasty of British history. Not everything can make your soul shine brighter than Doris Day, but this is a different kind of classic soul, drawing inspiration from Phil Spector's Wall of Sound productions in the mid-60s. George's voice grew in strength significantly across the first 2 albums, and the richness of his chest voice really starts to emerge here compared to the hushed, whispered tones of the first album, where George's best vocal work was really in his falsetto. This may not be the strongest song on Make It Big by any stretch of the imagination, but it's an impressive effort as a producer and as a songwriter, and will be yet another tool in the arsenal that he would employ on his way to become a Grammy award-winning solo artist. Throughout his solo career, George would competently cover many songs, arguably making his best attempt in 1990 when he put Stevie Wonder's They Won't Go When I Go to wax for his second LP, Listen Without Prejudice Volume 1. Both of the Wham albums contain a single cover song each, the first being a chaotically funky cover, Smokey-less Miracles' Love Machine. However, it was on Make It Big when they tackled the Isley Brothers' If You Were There that serves as the 4th feature on tonight's list. Ronald Isley is one of the most accomplished singers in history, going all the way back to Shout in the 50s and still putting out albums as of 2022. For George Michael, at the age of 20, to not only attempt this, but to perform it with the degree where I can't tell whose vocal I prefer is staggering. Wham and especially George wore their influences on their sleeves, and this song demonstrates that not only was George capable of growing into a mature singer and producer, but that his knowledge of music would allow him to flourish in the world of soul. This would open a plethora of doors for him to go on and work with the likes of Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, Stevie Wonder, Smokey Robinson. Like Wham, this next entry was a successful single, and it is by no means an obscure pick from the Wham catalogue. The 3rd single from Make It Big, Freedom, was released in October 1984 and would reach number 1 in the UK and number 3 in the US. A Motown-inspired soul hit featured one of George Michael's all-time vocal deliveries and a melody so sweet it should be checked regularly for diabetes. The single version would be extended by just 20 seconds, remixed to give the organ more prominence and necessitating the writing of extra horn parts for the outro. It would all tie a wonderful bow on an already impressive song. This, for me, was when George Michael proved that he could hang with the megastars of the time and was more than just a poser in tiny clothes and leather. Of course, it still retained that mass appeal that Wham always sought after, but there's just no arguing with the flexibility of George Michael's vocal performance here. Powerhouse performance, especially that pre-chorus. But you know that I'll forgive you just as once, twice, forever. Baby, you could drag me to hell and back just as long as we're together, and you do. The B-side of this was the previously discussed Heartbeat, Also have noticed the fact that Andrew Ridgeley wore a QPR shirt in the video, which was filmed on their 1985 tour of China. Knowing a thing or two about how QPR have operated as a football club since the 1980s, I would suspect the Chinese authorities took one look at that and vowed to distance themselves from Western pop music forever. Following Make It Big, Wham broke up, as Andrew Ridgeley had always suggested they had planned to upon reaching international success. 2 compilations were released in the aftermath of their final concert, which took place 3 days after George Michael's 23rd birthday. On the 28th of June 1986 at Wembley Stadium, there was a greatest hits compilation in the UK called The Final, whilst the USA received Music from the Edge of Heaven, which detailed just the remaining singles released over the course of 85 and 86. In effect, the US release could be seen as the 3rd studio Wham album, but The Final remains the more definitive of the 2, simply because it contains a rundown of the earlier material as well, including that single version of Freedom that I just mentioned. Amongst the 1986 tracks that would appear on both is Battle Stations, which would probably end up giving us the biggest clue as to where George Michael would head post-Wham. Produced by George Michael, it would use a drum machine and sophisti-pop-style horns, a sexy spoken word-style delivery that sees George sing of a relationship ridden with conflict as his partner grows increasingly distant, but he's simultaneously excited that they get to have sex on Wednesdays. George Michael went on record in 2011 in the liner notes of the special edition of Fate to say that the music he made for that album and the tracks that preceded it were directly inspired by Prince. This is him playing around with the idea of becoming a contemporary R&B artist and creating some funky drum beats and layered, thick backing vocals. And from this point on, producers like Jam and Lewis would take note. He would work with them to remix Monkey, for instance, in 1988. Battle Stations is a quirky piece of strictly 80s pop, but if that's your bag, you might want to hear this. It shows Wham laying down pop hooks as they were so wont to do, but driving space for the more experimental nature of the latter part of the 80s. The final track on tonight's Slam & 7 is taken directly from their concert in China, which was the first time a Western pop act had played in that country, and it did receive a great deal of media attention. Blue was a track that had previously been released as B-side to Club Tropicana from their first record, but playing in front of Chinese audiences gave George an opportunity to flesh out the lyrics, and they expanded the sound to make it much bigger. Manager Simon Napier Bell actually admits that the whole reason the concert took place was just to sabotage Queen's attempt to be the first band to play China. It was a completely surreal experience, and I still can't quite believe that it happened in the way that it did in such an isolated fashion. But it was made especially wonderful by the decision to take an obscure track and explore George's growing songwriting chops by giving it a lush saxophone part and developing the lyrics to a point where it actually felt like a new Wham song instead of just a revised old B-side. Now, with a bass line that's very close to the one that Michael Jackson would go on to use for his 1992 single Who Is It? This is another perfect example of George Michael outgrowing Wham and seeking something else beyond the chart success and life on the road with his friend, playing to hordes of screaming teenage girls. It's evident in all of these songs that Wham ran its course in hyperspeed. Andrew Ridgeley was the perfect bandmate to enable George Michael to come out of his shell, to assist him in finding himself and giving him the confidence to go ahead and seek that critical acclaim for which he was clearly so hungry. Wham was lightning in a bottle of insatiable talent who surrounded himself with the perfect pillars of support, from his humble and modest friend Andrew Ridgeley to his backing vocalists like Helen Pepsi Dumas and Shirley Holliman, better known as Pepsi and Shirley, and of course the band that would develop their early sound, including Dion Estes, as mentioned, but also Trevor Morrell, Tommy Eyre, Robert Arwai. Unlike the Smiths and other bands with similar career trajectories, Wham's breakup was by design, and it was always supposed to be the Cape Canaveral George Michael's solo career. If you're a fan of George Michael, as everyone should be, or indeed of pop music in general, you owe it to yourself to observe some of the songs on offer here, even if just to witness the formative soup. For it would overflow from the cauldron and give us one of Britain's most adored pop stars. Can you dig this thing? Are you gonna get down? Say Wham, say bam, stay funky.